Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We are continuing our journey through Joseph Schumpeter's monumental work, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. If you've been with us, we spent quite a bit of time in the last section digging into his very skeptical, competitive model of democracy. Today, we turn that sharp institutional lens onto the organizations that often define modern politics, socialist parties.
And this move is, well, it's critical. Schumpeter is now bridging the gap between the abstract theory, the nature of capitalism, the possibility of socialism, and the political reality on the ground. What's so striking about this section, Part V, is the profound sociological paradox it really brings to light.
Gorgeous.
Movements founded on the most radical, world-destroying doctrines, they inevitably become deeply institutionalized.
Right.
They start out as these revolutionary fires, but, to survive in the competitive marketplace of democracy, they have to adapt, they have to compromise, and ultimately they become part of the very system they were built to reject.
It's that age-old friction, isn't it, between the big revolutionary ideals and just the basic necessity of running an organization. But let's quickly anchor ourselves in the democratic theory we covered last time, because Schumpeter's definition of democracy fundamentally changes how he looks at these parties.
Absolutely. It's crucial. Recall that Schumpeter completely threw out what he called the classical doctrine.
Yeah, the idea that democracy is about the common good or the will of the people.
Exactly. The idea that democracy is a system where the rational common will of the people defines wise policy. He found that belief, well, frankly, utopian and just not supported by history or psychology.
So instead, he proposed his competitive model. Democracy is simply a political mechanism, a method.
Precisely. It is a competition among potential leaders for the power to govern, and that power is secured by getting the people's vote. The voters, in his view, don't rationally decide policy. They choose, or let's be honest, are often maneuvered into choosing, the individuals who will then rule them.
It's a pretty skeptical view.
Highly skeptical, highly realistic. And it sets the stage perfectly for analyzing socialist parties, not based on their lofty ideological manifestos, but based on their actual institutional behavior.
So we're stripping away the moral claims.
Completely. We're treating them purely as political enterprises, designed to gain and retain power, just like any other party in his competitive system.
And Schumpeter himself gives us a bit of a hint about his approach here, doesn't he? He confessed to a certain personal bias for Marx and Marxism.
He did, yeah. He noted the fascinating thing about socialist policy is its clear and close relation to a doctrinal basis.
So the ideas matter.
Well, that doctrinal rigor gives orthodox Marxism a unique intellectual dignity, as he explains it. It claims to be policy derived from a perception of historical necessity, not just, a vague set of preferences like other parties might have.
But his mission here isn't to judge the doctrine itself.
No, not really. His mission is fundamentally historical and sociological. He wants to observe how this clear, elegant, deterministic doctrine actually navigates the messy, constrained reality of competing for votes, dealing with trade unions, surviving within national political systems.
So we're watching the beautiful theory crash headfirst into the dirty organizational machine.
That's a great way to put it. Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack Schumpeter's historical survey then. It begins with what he rather dismissively calls the nonage of socialism. This is the era before Marx. Figures like Thomas More, Robert Owen, Proudhon, St. Simon.
Right. And his critique of these utopian socialists isn't really about their morals or the desirability of their visions. It's about their political viability, or lack thereof.
It's a sociological takedown, you said.
It really is. He basically summarizes their efforts as impotent longings out of contact with social realities. He doesn't call them stupid, not at all. He calls them politically ineffective. Their schemes, whether you're talking Owen's small, self-sufficient communes or Fourier's meticulously planned Felon Stairs, they were essentially unimplemented and unimplementable.
Why? What was fundamentally missing?
The mechanism of change. That's the core of it. They failed to identify a social process, or crucially, an existing or potential source of social power that could actually bring about the transition to their ideal state.
So they relied on.
They relied instead on what Schumpeter acidly labels Deus ex machina, gods from the machine.
Ah, like wishful thinking.
Exactly. Think of Robert Owen hoping a benevolent government or maybe some rich individuals would just see how great his model communities were and adopt them, or just relying on mass conversion to the sheer moral brilliance of the idea itself.
It's like planting rose trees and expecting them to survive on beauty alone, isn't it?
Perfect analogy. As he notes, this reliance on external unmoored forces just highlights the nature of utopianism. There was no internal, historical, or class-based force identified that would necessarily drive these schemes forward.
So if your whole system relies on the ruler of the day suddenly agreeing with you,
You have a moral suggestion, maybe a nice pamphlet, but you don't have a political program. You haven't identified the engine.
and this leads directly to that core quote Schumpeter uses to nail down the utopian failure, which then sets up why Marx was so different.
Yeah, he's crystal clear on this. He says, the real trouble is that there is no attempt to show how society is to evolve toward that ideal state, except possibly by conversion, or what the real factors are that might be worked upon in order to produce it, without identifying those factors.
You can't found a lasting party. You certainly can't give a politician a serious program that addresses real political constraints and possibilities. It's just floating in the air. Okay, so the great break happens when Marx enters the scene. Roughly around the Communist Manifesto in 1848, or maybe the First International in 1864. What did Marx inject that suddenly gave socialism political gravity?
Two things. Marx provided two absolutely non-negotiable criteria for seriousness, according to Schumpeter.
Okay, first.
First, he provided a historical doctrine, a theory that asserted the presence of a natural, inevitable tendency towards socialism. And this tendency wasn't just wishful thinking, it was driven by real social forces, specifically the inherent contradictions and escalating crises within capitalism itself.
So socialism moved from being a nice idea to being historically necessary.
Exactly. Elevated from a moral yearning to a practical economic inevitability. That's huge.
And the second criterion.
This is the political genius part. He established permanent and, importantly, exclusive contact with a reliable source of social power.
The industrial proletariat. He found his army, his vehicle for historical change.
Correct. By tying the revolutionary ideal directly to a specific, identifiable, growing, and theoretically empowered social class, Marx shifted socialism. He moved it from the realm of philosophy and moral argument firmly into political sociology.
And that's what made orthodox socialism an immediately serious political force, capable of demanding attention, building mass organizations.
Precisely. It gave it teeth. It gave it a base.
Yet Schumpeter, ever the contrarian, immediately goes back and revises the standard Marxist dismissal of the utopians. He suggests their work wasn't entirely useless after all.
He does. He gives them important credit. He says, okay, if their schemes were dreams, they were rationalized dreams. They articulated the submerged desires, the sort of hidden aspirations of the non-ruling classes. They helped bring these feelings out into the open, into public discourse. And furthermore, they provided some of the intellectual tools. You mentioned William Thompson earlier. His work elaborating the labor theory of value was a critical intellectual precursor that Marx heavily relied on, even if, Schumpeter notes, he didn't always credit it sufficiently.
So the utopians supplied maybe the emotional energy and some of the technical language, even if they lacked the political architecture to make it happen.
Yes, and Schumpeter adds another really interesting sociological point here. He suggests that much of the enduring, almost spiritual fervor of socialism, that irrational longing of the hungry soul, actually comes from those older, mystic utopian heresies. The stuff that economists, both bourgeois and socialist, try so hard to suppress with their dry models.
Interesting. So if socialist parties focus only on the economics and ditch that spiritual fire,
they risk losing the very popular appeal, the emotional engine, that sustains them as mass movements. It's not all about rational calculation.
that's a powerful point. Now here comes what feels like Schumpeter's really critical insight, the one that colors his entire analysis of how socialist parties actually behaved later on.
Which is?
Marx's decision to tie socialism exclusively to the laboring class. That was a specific choice he made, not some kind of logical necessity flowing from the analysis itself.
Exactly. Schumpeter sees it as an ideological a priori, a starting assumption, not an inevitable conclusion derived from observing society. He argues quite strongly that the labor movement and socialism are not intrinsically linked. They are separable phenomena.
And why does he think that?
Because, he argues, what the capitalist process actually increases over the long run is not the growing misery that Marx predicted would fuel catastrophic revolution.
No.
Instead, it increases labor's rising real income and social weight. Capitalism, ironically, tends to improve the material conditions of the working class. Which means this success ultimately increases labor's stake in the capitalist system. They have more to lose.
So the system is almost too successful for its own destruction. The workers are getting bought off, in a way. They're being integrated.
They're being integrated. And if we discard that core Marxian image of necessary catastrophic collapse, which Schumpeter clearly does, then the logic of social evolution doesn't necessarily require the working class to be the sole agent of socialist change.
He even suggests something quite provocative about who would really lead a revolution, doesn't he?
He does. He suggests that if some grand revolution were to occur, the proletariat would likely just be talked and bullied into consent. The real organizational and intellectual spearhead, he says, will be formed by intellectuals assisted by the semi-criminal rabble.
Wow. That's a stunning reversal of Marx's core axiom about the proletariat's historical mission.
It completely undermines it, sociologically speaking.
So if labor isn't the only possible revolutionary force, or even the primary driver of socialist change, Schumpeter identifies alternatives, forces that Marx either overlooked or dismissed as heretical.
Yes, he clearly points to two other major potential sources of socialist transformation. First, the state itself and its expanding bureaucracy.
Okay.
And second, those intellectual leaders of bourgeois extraction, the thinkers, the organizers, the administrators who come from outside the working class.
And this leads us directly to the forms of socialism that orthodox Marxists tended to dismiss, right? State socialism and Fabianism.
Exactly. Schumpeter is arguing quite powerfully that the internal logic of capitalist evolution could logically produce state-driven socialism, or gradual, incremental Fabian socialism, entirely without decisive pressure from the organized proletariat below.
So the system might socialize itself, so to speak.
Potentially. He sees these paths, state action, intellectual guidance, as standing entirely on par, logically, with the proletarian path. The socio-psychological process of capitalist evolution itself generates forces pushing towards state regulation, social protection, administrative control, things that look a lot like socialism.
This is a fair question, he concludes.
A very fair question to ask where organized socialism would even be without the fellow traveler, the sympathetic bourgeois figure, and especially the intellectual leader who came from the bourgeoisie. They often provided the initial ideas, the organizational skill, the strategic thinking.
So for Schumpeter, the intellectual is the true engine of political organization, maybe even more than the industrial worker they claim to represent.
In many ways, yes, that's a recurring theme. The capacity to organize, theorize, and maneuver politically often resides with this intellectual stratum. Okay, let's turn now to the man who defined the doctrine itself, Marx. Schumpeter makes a point of emphasizing that both Marx and Engels were fundamentally typical bourgeois intellectuals. Exiles, yes, but of bourgeois background and tradition. How did this biographical fact shape the tactical challenges faced by orthodox socialism? Oh, it shaped almost everything. Being uprooted after the failures of 1848, essentially cast off by the class that produced them, meant they were structurally alienated. They really only had two groups left to appeal to or to entrust their grand vision to.
Who are they?
Other similarly exiled intellectuals and the masses, specifically the industrial proletariat. This is why the doctrine that the workers must emancipate themselves became so absolutely foundational.
Even though Marx himself didn't spend much time with actual factory workers.
Right. It was almost a theoretical and psychological necessity for their own political self-definition as leaders without a conventional base. They needed the proletariat to be the historical agent.
And Schumpeter suggests this exile status also explains the intensity of their internationalism. Precisely. He makes that cutting observation. Having no country himself, he readily convinced himself that the proletariat had none.
Ouch.
Yeah. This fueled the belief in a kind of hyper-national socialist religion, an international proletariat whose class loyalty would always supersede national allegiance.
A doctrine that profoundly shaped their stance on foreign policy, pacifism, capitalist wars.
Absolutely. Though, as Schumpeter dryly notes, and as history would brutally show in 1914, that particular doctrine proved much, much weaker than national patriotism when push came to shove.
It's also important, isn't it, to touch on the tactical necessity of democracy for Marx, even while he fundamentally rejected bourgeois democracy as a sham. Yes, that's a key tension. Look, every opposition movement needs freedom to operate. Marx was no exception. He needed democratic institutions, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom to organize, simply because socialist activities, especially building mass organizations, couldn't really be carried on effectively, or with any comfort, in non-democratic environments like Tsarist Russia or Bismarck's Germany during the anti-socialist laws.
So Schumpeter sees this support for democracy as primarily tactical.
Largely, yes. He argues Marx kind of sidestepped the inherent contradiction using the system he condemned by claiming that only socialist democracy was true democracy. This allowed him to reject the legitimacy of the bourgeois state while still exploiting its mechanisms for his own organizational ends.
This core tension between the revolutionary theory and the practical needs of organization really comes to a head when we look at Marx's relationship with the actual real-world labor movement, particularly the English trade unions.
Oh, absolutely. This was the fundamental, enduring antagonism. By the 1860s, maybe 1870s, the English labor movement was becoming, as Schumpeter puts it, increasingly realistic and conservative.
Meaning the leaders, these are practical men, organizers, not philosophers, they were focused on very concrete goals. Soberly increasing wages, reducing working hours, securing the legal status and the economic bargaining power of their unions within the existing capitalist framework. They weren't trying to overthrow the system.
Not at all. They often viewed revolutionary ideas and the intellectuals promoting them as politically destabilizing, even a nuisance. They saw it as, potentially stupid or frivolous sabotage of labor's serious business, which was negotiation and securing tangible material gains for their members.
They prioritized getting a bigger slice of the pie over trying to bake a whole new, different pie.
Exactly. And that posed a direct ideological threat to orthodox Marxism. Because Marx and Engels, remember, weren't really involved in the day-to-day grind of organizing unions. From their theoretical standpoint, these practical gains were potentially dangerous.
Dangerous how?
Because they could lead the masses to adopt a bourgeois attitude, to become comfortable within capitalism, to lose their revolutionary zeal. Therefore, the official view from orthodox Marxists was that the trade union movement was something that must be converted to the doctrine of class war. Until that conversion happened, the movement was fundamentally in error, misconceiving its own true ends.
So you have the intellectual leaders basically telling the practical labor organizers that they don't understand their own real goals.
Precisely. And that creates this lasting rift, this fundamental antagonism. It's built right into the structure of the relationship.
Okay, so this antagonism forced Marx to confront two absolutely vital tactical questions for any mass movement hoping to gain traction. First, how do you relate to existing bourgeois parties? And second, what immediate non-revolutionary programs can you actually offer your followers?
Right. The answer to the first question, the relationship with bourgeois parties, was governed by the principle of strict anti-reformism.
Meaning no compromise. Essentially, yes. The logical position, stemming from the doctrine, was clear. True socialists must refuse to participate in what they saw as sham improvements, engineered by the bourgeoisie to prop up the system. Any such participation, which later got branded as reformism, was seen as a dangerous lapse from the faith. It was patching up the capitalist ship instead of letting it sink, which was the necessary historical outcome. The default presumption was always against cooperation. But as we know, just standing aside and saying everything is terrible, wait for the collapse, is politically impossible for a party trying to win votes or keep members happy. So how did Marx actually apply this anti-reformist logic while still needing to engage in immediate practical politics?
Well, with some genuinely impressive, if slightly convoluted tactical maneuvering. The great example Schumpeter uses is the free trade debate in England.
Right, a major policy push by the liberals.
Exactly. Free trade lowered food costs, which undeniably benefited the working class in the short term. Marx was far too good an economist not to recognize that immediate boon.
But if he supported it simply because it was good for workers,
he would lapse from the faith. He'd be admitting that capitalism could deliver positive reforms, undermining the necessity of revolution.
So the tactical trick was to support free trade, not because cheap bread was a good thing in itself, but, and here's the quote Schumpeter highlights, because it would quicken the pace of social evolution, hence the advent of the social revolution. It's an ideological sleight of hand.
Completely. You support the specific reform, but only because you frame it as accelerating the path towards the necessary catastrophe. That way, you maintain the revolutionary posture.
You're promoting the short-term good, but only for the sake of the long-term necessary destruction. Clever. Very clever. It allowed Marxists to claim credit for supporting progressive steps while theoretically staying true to the revolutionary cause. However, Schumpeter points out a flaw. This oracle, this justification, only really worked for measures that clearly promoted capitalist evolution, like free trade. It offered basically no guidance for social betterment measures that didn't clearly fit that narrative, like social insurance or factory regulations. That left future generations of socialists in a bit of a tactical bind. Okay, and the second thorny question, the need for an immediate program forced Marx and Engels to essentially drop the pure revolutionary logic entirely, didn't it? If you're just waiting for the system to collapse, you shouldn't really need a positive program of things to do now.
In strict logic, no. Marxism, as pure doctrine, had no positive program for action within capitalism, because anything positive done under capitalism was inherently painted, a mere palliative. But, as you said, a political party cannot survive, let alone grow, without promising some immediate, tangible benefits to its potential supporters.
People need a reason to join today.
Exactly. So Schumpeter notes that back in 1847, Marx and Engels resolutely cut the Gordian knot. They just did it. How? By including a whole list of popular immediate demands right there in the Communist Manifesto.
They essentially created a kind of radical stockpot, just throwing everything in.
It was a complete grab bag, yes. Schumpeter says the Communist Manifesto quite illogically lists a number of immediate objects of socialist policy, simply laying the socialist barge alongside the liberal liner.
Things like universal suffrage, progressive income tax,
nationalization of certain industries, free education. These demands were largely taken from the general pool of radical bourgeois liberalism that was current at the time.
And Schumpeter views this not as a coherent program, but
as a mere makeshift. Something intended to cover an embarrassing practical weakness in the pure doctrine. It proved, however, that Marx and Engels were, above all, supreme opportunists when organizational survival demanded it.
Because if Marx had genuinely cared about achieving those specific items above all else,
he would have had to sacrifice the revolutionary creed entirely and fully merge with the liberal or radical movements pushing for those same reforms. As he didn't see those reforms as the ultimate goal, only as steps or maybe even distractions, he felt no obligation to sacrifice the bigger revolutionary picture for their sake. He could pick them up and drop them as needed.
This constant tension, this need to compromise the purity of the doctrine for the sake of tactical unity and organizational growth, was really cemented during the struggles within the First International starting in 1864.
Oh, absolutely. That organization, the First International Working Men's Association, was a huge, incredibly diverse coalition. Schumpeter calls it a caravanserai. You had English trade unionists, French Proudhonists, German Lassalleans, Bakunitist anarchists, Orthodox Marxists, all trying to coexist.
Holding that together must have been a nightmare. It required constant, judicious maneuvering and compromise, as Schumpeter puts it. Marx had to compromise on key doctrinal points, like the abolition of inheritance, or deal with awkward, unsocialist, nationalistic incidents among the members. It was this constant necessity of watering down the pure creed just to maintain basic unity that led to Marx's famous, slightly humorous, but also despairing exclamation, "Je suis pas marxiste."
Yeah.
He feared that by making all these necessary tactical concessions to build the movement, he had inadvertently created something that would ultimately betray his original pure vision.
Exactly. He worried the vehicle he built might drive off in the wrong direction entirely.
And Schumpeter sort of wraps up this section by concluding that Marx's entire political method, while organizationally brilliant in many ways, was ultimately founded upon a fundamental political error of diagnosis.
What error was that?
Believing the revolution was genuinely close at hand. He compares it to the early Christians believing the day of judgment was imminent.
Ah, the eschatological expectation.
Right. And the short-term expectation, this belief that collapse was just around the corner, justified extreme tactics, uncompromising stances, and theoretical shortcuts that proved completely unsustainable when the imminent collapse just never materialized decade after decade. And that is the absolute perfect segue into the next major phase Schumpeter analyzes. The period where socialist parties had to confront the hard reality of not collapsing the system anytime soon, but rather figuring out how to live indefinitely within it. They had to institutionalize or simply fade away. Right. This is where Schumpeter's sociological analysis really takes flight, isn't it? We move into the period of genuine institutionalization, roughly 1875 to 1914. And he starts with the German Social Democratic Party, the SPD, founded in 1875. This case presents what seems like the central paradox.
He really does.
Why did Germany, a country with arguably the most progressive, proactive, reform-minded state bureaucracy in Europe at the time, produce the most rigidly, virulently orthodox Marxist party? Shouldn't it have been the other way around?
It's an incredible piece of counterintuitive history, and Schumpeter tackles it head-on. As you said, Germany had a state apparatus under Bismarck, and later William II that was far more proactive in rolling out social reforms than, say, laissez-faire England.
They were practicing a kind of state socialism. Effectively, yes. Partly to steal the thunder from the growing socialist opposition, but also because they had this unique resource. the Cafeter Socialists, the Socialists of the Chair, university professors, academics.
Exactly. Highly educated academics and civil servants who were sympathetic to social reform and fed ideas, policy proposals, and expert drafting skills directly to the state bureaucracy. They helped design things like Germany's pioneering social insurance programs.
So while Marx was insisting theoretically that only the proletariat could emancipate itself through revolution,
The German imperial state was busy providing state-of-the-art social insurance, expertly drafted, efficiently managed, long before the SPD could ever realistically hope to gain the power to implement such things itself.
and Schumpeter stresses, crucially, that this state socialism was neither a fake nor utopian.
No, it was real. It delivered tangible benefits. It represented effective social progress enacted from above. Theoretically, you'd think this should have completely annihilated the SPD's reason for being. Why do we need a revolutionary party if the existing state is already implementing social reforms?
So what explains the paradox? Why did the SPD stick so rigidly to orthodox Marxism?
Schumpeter points to two key factors that work together. First, Bismarck's coercion, and second, the resulting political vacuum the party found itself in.
Let's take the coercion first. Bismarck's anti-socialist laws, which were in effect from 1878 to 1890.
Right. These laws were intended to crush the party, suppress its press, ban its meetings. But paradoxically, they ended up strengthening its orthodox core. By subjecting the party to state repression, they forged a core of incredibly dedicated, battle-hardened leadership men, molded by the shared experience of prison and exile. This fostered intense internal loyalty and effectively cemented the revolutionary phraseology as the party's defining trademark, its badge of honor. Persecution purified the ranks, weeded out the less committed, and centralized control in the hands of dedicated orthodox leaders like August Bebel.
Okay, so repression strengthened the revolutionary identity. What about the second factor, the political vacuum?
This created the unique and, for the party's orthodoxy, very comfortable niche that Schumpeter calls power without responsibility.
Explain that.
The German political system at the time was unique. After the anti-socialist laws lapsed in 1890, the SPD was allowed to organize freely, contest elections, build unions, and expand its vote base dramatically, which it did, often helped by the sheer ineptitude of its non-socialist competitors.
But
it was completely excluded from any real share of power in the imperial government. The Kaiser and his chancellor held executive power. Because the SPD could not realistically expect to rule or even participate in governing coalitions anytime soon, they never had to face the messy reality of compromising their pure doctrine to actually run the country.
Ah, I see. They could afford to maintain ideological purity because they never had to put it to the test of practical governance.
Precisely. They never had to make the painful trade-offs that come with holding office. And ironically, the imperial bureaucracy, which they officially despised and denounced in revolutionary terms, was actually delivering many of the necessary social reforms anyway.
So orthodoxy became less a plan for action and more
A highly successful organizational strategy. The revolutionary flag, the commitment to pure Marxism, was the best possible way to maintain party cohesion, inspire loyalty among the members, and create a distinct, powerful identity in the political marketplace. Meanwhile, their day-to-day parliamentary work could be highly practical and pragmatic, focusing on incremental gains without challenging the overall framework.
And this is what led to Schumpeter's really powerful, almost biting illustration of the German party's functional orthodoxy. Can you share that quote again? Yes, it captures the situation perfectly. Thus, serious, patriotic, and law-abiding men continued to repeat the irresponsible slogans of revolution and treason, blissfully conscious of the fact that there was little likelihood of their having to act upon them.
Wow, so orthodoxy served as a protective shield for the organization, not really a weapon aimed at imminent revolution.
Exactly. It was the glue holding the machine together, allowing it to grow powerful within its specific political cage. But this huge disconnect between the radical revolutionary doctrine they preached and the practical reformist reality they lived couldn't last forever without challenge, right? This leads directly to the revisionist crisis.
Absolutely. The pressure eventually had to find an outlet, and it did, most famously through Edward Bernstein.
Who was he?
Bernstein was a prominent SPD theorist who spent years in exile in England. There, he observed firsthand the increasing stability and adaptability of capitalism and the practical, non-revolutionary successes of the British labor movement. He came to realize that the core Marxian prediction of imminent capitalist collapse, the whole catastrophe vision, was simply failing to materialize.
So he proposed.
He proposed to revise the entire theoretical structure of the creed. He attacked the Hegelian philosophical underpinnings. He rejected the increasing misery thesis. He doubted the inevitability of socialism through collapse. And most controversially, he advocated for open cooperation with progressive bourgeois parties to achieve reforms now.
He essentially argued that the movement, the practical day-to-day work of achieving reforms, was everything, and the final goal, the revolutionary end state, was secondary, perhaps even irrelevant.
Precisely. The movement is everything, the goal is nothing, became the slogan associated with him. And this, of course, posed an absolutely existential threat to the SPD's leadership and its entire organizational identity.
Because if capitalism wasn't collapsing, and gradual reforms were actually possible and desirable, then why maintain the burdensome, isolating revolutionary identity at all? Why not just become a radical reform party?
Exactly. It cut to the very heart of the party's raison d'etre. The leadership, primarily the pragmatic organizer August Bebel and the chief theorist Karl Kautsky, often called the Pope of Marxism, understood immediately that they had to fight revisionism, at least officially. They had to defend the revolutionary flag because it was their unique organizational trademark, the source of their discipline and power.
So they condemned Bernstein's ideas.
Oh, yes. They formally anathematized revisionism at major party conventions, Hanover in 1899, Dresden in 1903. They reaffirmed the orthodox doctrines of class war and inevitable revolution. However, and this is where Schumpeter highlights Bebel's supreme political mastery.
Yes.
He accommodated the revisionists personally. He managed the conflict brilliantly.
A classic separation of theory and practice.
Absolutely. The revisionist theories were condemned in principle, maintaining the party's official orthodox face. But the revisionist people, like Bernstein himself, were largely allowed to remain within the party fold and continue their practical reform work in Parliament and the unions.
So Bebel prioritized organizational unity above all else. He avoided a potentially disastrous purge.
He did. He understood that the powerful trade union leaders, who were, as Schumpeter says, revisionists all along in their actual day-to-day work, would happily submit to the theoretical reaffirmation of class war and revolution as long as it didn't actually interfere with their practical business of securing better wages and working conditions.
So the revolutionary rhetoric was conserved because it unified the organization and maintained its distinct brand.
Well, the practical reformist work was allowed to continue because it satisfied the immediate needs and desires of the membership and the union base. It was a masterful, if perhaps cynical, balancing act.
A brilliant strategy, really, ensuring the SPD survived and thrived as this cohesive, powerful, yet internally contradictory political machine. Now, Schumpeter contrasts that German rigidity maintaining orthodoxy as an organizational tool with the very different path of institutional success achieved through deliberate pragmatism elsewhere, particularly in England with Fabianism.
Yes, Fabianism, which emerged around 1883, was in almost every way the structural antithesis of the German SPD experience.
How so?
Well, first, it wasn't a mass party at all. It was a small, elite group of highly educated bourgeois intellectuals, people like Sidney and Beatrice Webb, George Bernard Shaw. Second, they deliberately, consciously avoided the language and posture of class war and revolution.
What was their strategy then? Their genius, according to Schumpeter, lay in their method. Permeation. They focused on influencing the key men, the influential politicians, the senior civil servants, the local government administrators. Since England at the time lacked the highly centralized, academically infused state bureaucracy of Germany, the Fabians essentially stepped into that gap. They acted as an unofficial, unpaid intellectual think tank, providing research policy papers.
Exactly. They provided well-researched, evidence-based, practical policy proposals to administrators and politicians who needed ideas and lacked the resources to develop them internally. They focus on specific, manageable problems.
So they were working through the existing system very quietly, almost invisibly, without seeking mass political mobilization or confrontation.
Precisely. Their goal was undoubtedly a fundamental reconstruction of society along socialist lines, but they pursued it through incremental, gradual, well-researched steps. They famously took their name from a Roman general Fabius Cunctator the Delayer, who defeated Hannibal not through decisive battles, but through persistent harassment and strategic patience.
And Schumpeter has quite a provocative take on their relationship to Marx, doesn't he?
He does. He suggests that, in a practical political sense, the Fabians were perhaps better Marxists than Marx was himself.
How could that be?
Because, Schumpeter argues, they implicitly recognize that socialization is actually a slow, evolutionary institutional process, not a sudden catastrophic event. By concentrating on the practical problems within practical politics, things like public health reform, municipal ownership of utilities, improvements in education, they were moving patiently in step with the actual gradual evolution of social institutions. This, Schumpeter implies, was a more genuinely historical materialist approach than Marx's own insistence on imminent violent rupture.
So, in effect, they were achieving socialist ends often via non-socialist means, leveraging the existing capitalist infrastructure and state machinery for gradual transformation.
Exactly. They were masters of bureaucratic and administrative maneuvering. Their success, of course, was entirely contingent on the specific political culture of late Victorian and Edwardian England, which was relatively open to listening to detached, nonpartisan expertise, especially at the local government level.
So they operated in the background, subtly reshaping local governments, influencing the civil service.
And thereby ensuring that the socialist transformation in England, when it came, was largely a bureaucratic and administrative process, quite divorced from the revolutionary fervor or direct action of the masses that Marx had envisioned.
Fascinating. And you mentioned Sweden earlier as offering perhaps an even smoother example of this kind of institutional adaptation.
Yes, Schumpeter holds up Sweden as almost the ideal type of smooth, non-convulsive evolution towards social democracy. Their socialist party grew slowly, organically, within what he describes as an exceptionally well-balanced social structure.
What was key there?
Crucially, he notes, the cultural and social gulf between the intellectuals leading the party and the working class base was relatively low. There wasn't the same sharp divide you saw elsewhere.
And the result?
The result was that when the Swedish socialists eventually gained responsible government office, the transition was remarkably peaceful and pragmatic. The actual policy differences between them and the other mainstream bourgeois parties were often minimal, frequently boiling down to relatively minor financial questions about how much to spend on social purposes that the entire political spectrum had already largely accepted in principle.
So the Swedish experience really validates the idea that core socialist goals, welfare state, regulation can potentially be achieved entirely through democratic reform if the underlying sociopolitical context is stable and balanced enough.
It certainly suggests that possibility, yes. A stark contrast to the German model of maintaining revolutionary rhetoric while being excluded, or the Fabian model of elite permeation.
Okay, so we've seen orthodoxy maintained through exclusion, Germany, and transformation achieved through quiet permeation, Fabians, or smooth integration, Sweden. Finally, Schumpeter turns to cases he characterizes as the radicalism of impotence. Situations where the revolutionary doctrine remained pure and intense precisely because practical political engagement was impossible or seemed utterly fruitless. This leads to violence or sectarianism, and he focuses on Russia and France.
Right. Russia provides the perfect antithesis to all the successful or at least functional institutional models we've discussed. Tsarist Russia, Schumpeter points out, was fundamentally pre-capitalist, overwhelmingly agrarian, politically autocratic, and deeply unstable.
So Marxism, with its focus on industrial capitalism and the proletariat, was structurally inapplicable.
Largely, yes. The industrial proletariat was tiny, a minuscule fraction of the population. Yet, paradoxically, Marxism was embraced with incredible fervor by the Russian intelligentsia.
Why, if it didn't fit the conditions?
Because it offered a powerful, deterministic, intellectually satisfying, and crucially revolutionary narrative in an environment where normal, liberal, democratic methods seemed completely blocked and futile. It provided hope and a sense of historical purpose to intellectuals facing a repressive, seemingly unchangeable autocratic system.
So Marxism became almost a secular religion for these alienated intellectuals facing a closed political system.
In many ways, yes. Schumpeter suggests the very intensity of their radicalism was inversely proportional to their practical possibilities for achieving change through normal democratic or parliamentary means. The less possible reform seemed, the more appealing revolutionary dogma became.
And this specific Russian environment, this gap between doctrine and reality, led directly to that crucial split in the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in 1903, the Bolsheviks versus the Mensheviks.
Exactly. And specifically to Lenin's pivotal realization, Lenin recognized that if revolution was to happen in Russia, it couldn't wait for the slow development of capitalism and the maturation of the proletariat, as orthodox Marxism prescribed. It required decisive action in what was sociologically an immature situation.
And who would lead this action?
Not the masses themselves initially. It had to be led, Lenin argued, by a resolute and well-disciplined group, a vanguard party composed of professional revolutionaries, mostly intellectuals, who would guide and direct the less politically conscious workers and peasants.
This sounds remarkably like a direct practical implementation of Schumpeter's earlier, almost cynical point that any real revolution would likely be led by intellectuals, assisted by the semi-criminal rabble, with the proletariat being talked and bullied into consent.
It really is the ultimate, albeit perhaps unintentional, vindication of Schumpeter's sociological insight about the primacy of leadership and organization, especially in chaotic situations. But as Schumpeter is very careful to stress, this Leninist strategy represents a fundamental divorce from Marxism's innermost meaning.
How so?
Because the original Marxian dogma absolutely insisted that the emancipation of the working class must be the work of the working class itself. It had to arise organically from historical conditions. Lenin, faced with Russian reality, effectively made the revolution the work of a professional, disciplined band of intellectuals officering the rabble, imposing revolution from above through political will and organization. His strategy was fundamentally un-Marxian in its reliance on voluntarism, on pronunciamento, on disciplined, non-proletarian action taking precedence over sociological necessity.
A fascinating and historically momentous deviation. Now, French syndicalism also rejected the conventional political path, but it seems driven by a different kind of frustration.
Yes, Schumpeter argues French syndicalism emerged from a deep disillusionment, not so much with autocracy, but with the perceived instability, corruption, and governmental inefficiency of the French Third Republic's parliamentary system.
And specific incidents fueled this.
Incidents like Millerandism in 1899 were key. This was when Alexandre Millerand, a prominent socialist, actually accepted a post in a bourgeois coalition cabinet. To the pure political theorists on the left, this was an outrageous betrayal of principle rank opportunism. But Schumpeter suggests that for many ordinary workers, it signaled something else.
What did it signal to them?
It signaled that parliamentary socialism was just another cynical political game being played by ambitious intellectuals using the workers' movement for their own careers. It bred a deep contempt for the entire political process, for politicians, for parliaments, for intellectual leaders altogether.
So syndicalism arose as fundamentally apolitical and anti-political. It despised the whole parliamentary game.
Exactly. It rejected parliamentary action and intellectual leadership, appealing instead directly to the workers' supposed raw emotional instincts, particularly instincts for direct action, solidarity, and violence. Its central strategic idea was achieving workers' control of the means of production, not through the state, but directly through the trade unions, the syndicates seizing control of the workshops.
And the key weapon was the general strike.
The general strike became the core myth and goal. Often championed theoretically by Georges Sorel, it wasn't conceived as just a pragmatic bargaining tool. It was elevated into a powerful, almost mystical social myth, a spontaneous, non-rational, potentially violent means of mass action that would shatter the bourgeois state and usher in a new era, bypassing the corrupting influence of politics and intellectuals entirely. It was a complete rejection of the democratic rationalism that underpinned the Third Republic.
And Schumpeter's assessment of syndicalism's intellectual foundation.
He is brutally dismissive. He finds its economic and sociological reasoning utterly flimsy, noting dryly that its tenets cannot be espoused by anyone afflicted by any trace of economic or sociological training. He sees it primarily as an expression of brute, ideological pugnacity, and emotional rejection of political complexity and compromise. And historically, he notes, it tended to dissolve fairly quickly when confronted with organized state resistance or the practical realities of running national institutions. It was potent as a protest movement, but lacked a viable long-term strategy.
Okay, we've covered this incredible historical sweep, from the impotence of the utopians, through the tactical tightrope walk of Marx, the paradoxical orthodoxy of the German SPD, the quiet pragmatism of the Fabians, the smooth integration in Sweden, and finally the radicalism born of frustration in Russia and France. If we try to synthesize Schumpeter's historical method across all these cases, what's the single overarching conclusion he seems to draw about the destiny of mass political movements, especially radical ones?
I think the fundamental conclusion, the thread that runs through the entire analysis, is that institutional and organizational constraints are almost always the decisive factors in shaping a movement's long-term political evolution. These practical realities consistently trump pure ideology when push comes to shove.
So his method, which feels very much aligned with Max Weber's focus on bureaucracy and rationalization.
Very much so. It's a deeply institutionalist sociological approach. And using this lens, he demonstrates fairly convincingly the historical failure of the core Marxian prediction, the imminent, catastrophic collapse of capitalism leading to proletarian revolution. The movements that actually survived, gained influence, and achieved some measure of power, whether it was the German SPD, the Austrian Socialists, the Fabians in Britain, did so not primarily through revolutionary action, but through building strong organizations, fostering loyalty, developing bureaucracies, and making strategic accommodations to the existing state power structures.
So the success of German orthodoxy, for instance, wasn't really about their commitment to revolution.
No, it was largely a function of their specific political situation, an organizational tool made viable by their structural exclusion from executive power. It allowed them to maintain cohesion without having to face the messy compromises of governing.
And he consistently emphasizes the absolutely indispensable role of leadership, particularly intellectual leadership, often drawn from the bourgeoisie, right?
Yep.
Over and above the role of the industrial proletariat itself.
Yes, that's another major through line. Whether you're looking at the Fabians subtly maneuvering behind the scenes in London, or figures like Bebel in Germany and Victor Adler in Austria skillfully managing the tensions between their radical intellectual wings and their practical trade union bases, the trajectory of these parties almost always hinged on the political and organizational skill of the leadership. Their ability to adapt the doctrine, sometimes quite cynically, to fit the specific national political reality was paramount, often forcing them to act against the pure letter of the doctrine itself, just to keep the organization afloat and effective.
The intellectual leader provides the blueprint, the strategy, the organizational architecture.
And the organization itself, the party machine, absorbs the inevitable shocks and compromises forced upon it by political reality.
This inherent complexity, this diversity of national experiences and strategies, must have made coordinating these parties internationally incredibly difficult. Which brings us to the Second International, established in 1889.
Absolutely. Schumpeter sees the Second International not as a revolutionary high command poised for immediate global action that was never realistic, but more as a necessary, if ultimately fragile, administrative structure. Its real functions were coordination, standardization of rhetoric to some extent, maintaining contact between national parties, and providing a symbolic forum.
But it wasn't built for immediate, unified revolutionary action.
Not at all. It was forced into an almost impossible balancing act, needing to maintain a structure broad enough and flexible enough to tolerate the huge range of parties under its umbrella. Everyone from the thoroughly reformist Swedes like Hjalmar Branting or Danes like Thorvald Stauning, all the way over to the committed revolutionaries like Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg.
And the German Marxists, the SPD, were really the linchpin holding that incredibly diverse coalition together, weren't they?
They were the absolute core, yes.
Yeah.
As the largest, wealthiest, and most doctrinally prestigious Marxist party, they played the central role. But their leadership, particularly Bebel, understood perfectly well that the vast majority of their affiliates, the French Socialists, the British Labour Party, the Belgians, the Austrians, weren't truly orthodox Marxists in practice, whatever lip service they paid.
So the Germans had to compromise.
They had to practice a kind of diplomatic forbearance. They allowed affiliated parties to sign up to the high-minded, quasi-revolutionary resolutions passed at the International's Congresses, the 39 articles of the Socialist Creed, so to speak, while tacitly reserving for each national party almost unlimited freedom of interpretation and action back home. Bebel's skillful management of these contradictions was, Schumpeter thinks, a brilliant act of socialist diplomacy, designed primarily to maintain the appearance of a united international front over the long haul.
But ultimately, that fragile structure couldn't hold.
No. It was always, as Schumpeter puts it, engaged in a race against time. Could international socialist solidarity be built strongly enough, quickly enough, to prevent a major European war? The outbreak of World War I in 1914 provided the brutal answer. The International collapsed overnight as almost every national socialist party rallied behind its own government's war effort.
So Schumpeter concludes the failure wasn't really of the International itself,
but rather a failure at the domestic fronts within the individual national parties. National loyalty, national identity proved decisively, overwhelmingly stronger than the abstract ideal of international working-class solidarity when tested by war. The International was only as strong as its constituent parts, and those parts chose nation over class.
Okay, let's try to bring this incredibly rich historical analysis, written mostly in the 1930s and early 40s, forward. How can Schumpeter's historical lens help us understand the political movement, particularly on the left, that we see around us today?
Well, I think one of the most enduring takeaways is its stark reminder of the unyielding nature of institutional limits on radicalism. Schumpeter's history strongly suggests that if any radical movement, left or right, wants to achieve lasting political relevance and power within a democratic system, it inevitably faces immense pressures.
Pressures to do what?
To organize effectively, which requires bureaucracy, to attract a broad enough electorate to win votes, which requires moderating extreme positions, to build a reliable administrative capacity if it ever hopes to govern. And that entire process, almost without exception in Schumpeter's historical examples, necessitates the cooling of the initial revolutionary fire. It demands the compromise of absolute ideological purity.
So his history suggests that if a radical party actually gains political relevance and gets close to power,
It must eventually compromise its original pure creed. The very act of successfully institutionalizing within a competitive democracy forces adaptation and moderation. Radical purity is often a luxury afforded only by political marginalization or exclusion. And this brings us right back to that key reflective question Schumpeter implicitly poses, the one we should really put to you, the listener. Can socialist parties, or perhaps any radically transformative party, remain genuinely transformative once they become embedded within existing democratic institutions? And Schumpeter's historical analysis suggests, I think, that transformation is possible, but perhaps only or most likely through the slow, patient, Fabian method gradual, persistent institutional adaptation and permeation, rather than through the sudden ruptural revolutionary catastrophe that Marx predicted and that initially animated many of these movements. The change, when it happens via institutions, tends to be insidious, administrative, bureaucratic, often unfolding over generations.
it also forces us to reconsider the modern relevance of Lenin's strategy, doesn't it? That idea of using a highly disciplined, ideologically committed band of intellectuals to lead and mobilize the masses, somewhat divorced from the underlying sociological ripeness for revolution.
That's a really profound connection to contemporary politics, I think. Schumpeter's description of Lenin leveraging strong, disciplined, often non-proletarian leadership to mobilize an alienated base in what he saw as an immature or unstable situation resonates deeply with many contemporary populist and radical movements we see today, right across the political spectrum.
How so?
Well, think about how many successful modern movements, both left and right, rely heavily on charismatic, often outsider or non-establishment leaders. Leaders who use powerful, often simplifying or revolutionary-sounding rhetoric to bypass traditional party structures and directly mobilize a base that feels disconnected from or betrayed by the political status quo.
It certainly forces us to ask a fundamental question about political change today.
Is radical political change primarily driven by deep, underlying systemic economic forces and class interests, as Marx hoped and predicted? Or is it more often driven by the organizational skill, the strategic choices, and the rhetorical force of professional political entrepreneurs, often intellectuals or quasi-intellectuals, as Schumpeter's analysis of Lenin and even the Fabians might suggest?
And Schumpeter, with his characteristic skepticism about the rationality of the masses and his focus on elite competition, seems to be making a strong, if perhaps cynical, case for the latter. The intellectual, the professional administrator, the skilled bureaucrat, the charismatic organizer, they are the real agents of sustained political change, regardless of the specific slogans they choose to shout at any given moment.
The structure, the organization, the leadership skill, these matter profoundly, perhaps more than the purity of the initial slogan. The institutions inevitably absorb, adapt, channel, and often neutralize the raw revolutionary intent over time.
Which brings us perfectly to the final provocative thought we wanted to leave you with today. A thought that Schumpeter's historical sketch strongly supports, even if he doesn't state it quite this boldly.
Go on.
Think about some of the biggest, most lasting ideological victories often associated with the socialist project in the 20th century. Things like the widespread establishment of the comprehensive welfare state, extensive government regulation of industry, highly progressive taxation systems.
Okay, hallmarks of social democracy in many Western countries.
Exactly. Now, how were these truly transformative policies actually achieved? Were they primarily the result of the revolutionary proletariat rising up and demanding change, as Marx envisioned? Were they mainly implemented by electorally successful orthodox Marxist parties seizing power?
Well, Schumpeter's history suggests probably not in most cases.
Right. Instead, weren't these changes often quietly, incrementally secured by state bureaucracies, by pragmatic politicians responding to crises or seeking votes, and crucially, by networks of bourgeois intellectuals and experts? The Fabians in Britain, The Cathedral Socialists feeding the German civil service, the technocrats of the American progressive era, and the New Deal. People operating entirely within and often actively leveraging the existing capitalist system and its state machinery.
So the conclusion is that institutional transformation's slow, often insidious, frequently bureaucratic, proved far more effective in achieving many concrete socialistic outcomes than the dramatic expectation of catastrophic collapse and revolutionary seizure of power. The system incorporates and adapts to the pressure for change, often without the Revolutionary Party ever getting direct credit or achieving total control.
A genuinely sobering conclusion on the complex relationship between radical ideas, political organization, and the persistent power of institutions. Next time, we promise, we move into the final chapters of Schumpeter's political analysis in Part V of the book. He steps back again to look at the broader picture, returning to the fundamental sociological conditions that he believes are necessary for his competitive model of democracy to survive and function effectively in the long run. Yeah, we'll be looking at Schumpeter's final, almost prescriptive reflections, he asks. What underlying conditions does competitive democracy actually need? He examines things like the need for a certain level of economic development and social homogeneity, the crucial importance of the quality and self-restraint of the political class, and the absolute necessity of a strong, competent, and independent civil service. It sounds like a detailed and, you said, frankly sobering look at the potential fragility of this political mechanism he spent so much time clinically analyzing.
It is. He lays out the conditions for success, but implicitly raises serious questions about whether those conditions can always be met or maintained. It's a crucial part of his overall argument.
Sounds fascinating. Join us then for the next deep dive.